Well, good morning, everyone, and also let me extend my thanks to Rajshri and her team. They've been wonderful hosts here. This is also my first time in India, and it's been a wonderful week thanks to their very generous hospitality. So thank you, Rajshri. My own personal appreciation for the power of design stems largely from a multi-year very generous masterclass that I've enjoyed from Paula, from our previous speaker. And so it's deeply humbling to follow her here on stage. So you heard Paula talk about various facets of design, some of them informed by science, responding to science, interacting with science. What I will hope to achieve in the next few minutes is kind of go deeper into this particular aspect of contemporary design. My own perspective, my own recognition of the role of design comes from science, and so I want to start by sharing with you some of my observations about the role of science first in the world and how that's changing, and then from there we'll sort of build a thesis for what I see as a very promising and unique role for design. So if we look at the world over the last several months, several years, just in the last even 18 months. And we look at some of these issues that have driven headlines around the world. Clearly, we are in a moment of great transformation. Maybe not since the end of World War II do we have an opportunity to rethink really all of the systems that make up the underpinnings of the world: social, economic, political, geopolitical, technological, regulatory, legal. Each and every one of them right now feels very much up for grabs in response to what seems to be this critical point on the curve of modern civilization. And when we look at these transformations, these moments that are changing everything from the way we look at warfare to population, to citizen engagement, to our reaction to capitalism, to our views on democracy, all of these things right now seem very much up for grabs. To go one step further, clearly the world has always been complex. Right now we talk about complexity as if it's some new phenomenon, and to a large extent the complexity that we see in the world is heightened. But right now, the notable thing about the complexity of the issues that we care about in the world is that it's actually caused us to now be unable to resolve any single issue without coming up with some new paradigm. So let me give you an example. If you're sitting around the table at a global conference trying to solve or develop an emergency response, a preparedness mechanism for global disease, to forecast disease in a particular country over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So that's an important task. And in the past, we might look at the trajectory of diseases that arise with that disease. So we might say, well, if disease X has risen at this pace, well, we know from historical trends that disease Y will naturally sort of take shape over some period of time. And then we can build models based on that. We understand the evolution of disease itself. We might even incorporate genetics into our understanding of how that disease might evolve and mutate. But we sort of reached some mechanism of decision-making through that means alone. Today, we recognize that to really understand and forecast disease, we would benefit from understanding the local climate. We would understand that climate change and how we might project outwards over that same 10 years in climate will affect disease and how that disease might spread or come about, or how mosquitoes might carry that disease. But to understand climate in that same 10, 15-year horizon, today we would also recognize that we need to understand the impact of CO2 emissions in that same country. So we would look at energy futures, we would look at forecasts for sources of energy, renewable, alternative, and so on, and we would need now a 10, 15-year horizon view of energy consumption in that same country. Probably we would benefit from expanding out now beyond that country, right? So as we think about climate and energy, maybe disease we could look at in that same environment, but now we're probably realizing that borders no longer work. And we can't use borders to understand this anymore. We might need to look at a region. Climate's not local. Disease isn't local. So now we've looked at energy. We started at disease. To understand energy, we'd probably want to understand population. We'd probably want to understand how is the population growing over that same period of time. What's the demographic makeup of that population? So if there's an emerging middle class, their energy needs and expectations of energy availability will be different than if the demographic socioeconomic makeup is otherwise. So now we need a population model over that period of time. But to arrive at a population model, we need to be able to project outwards in terms of disease. So every one of these issues that before seemed resolvable is now intractable. And so we're at a moment where we've failed miserably as a world on Doha, we've failed miserably as a world on Kyoto, and we've failed miserably as a world on Syria. So at each one of these momentous opportunities for our civilization to do something, seemingly the mechanisms that we have at place and the lens through which we tackle these issues is bankrupt. And specifically, the mechanisms that have given birth to the ways of thinking and resolving previous major global trade agreements or major seemingly sort of climate-related agreements, these systems no longer work. And so we're rethinking economics, we're rethinking democracy, we're rethinking religion and its role in society. And we can go deeper into this in coffee breaks afterwards, each of these, in my estimation, has failed to live up to the challenges of this particular moment. And so I would argue that of all of the constructs humanity has manufactured that we have made to understand the world, to make sense of the world, only science has the capacity to negotiate that complexity. Only science, through its method, its culture, its instability, its relationship with truth, which is asymptotal and not didactic and not dogmatic, only science has the capacity, through scientific thinking, through advancing a method of science that can be adopted across society, can take us forward. And so just to phrase this, this is what I believe, only by thinking scientifically will we all, people, businesses, and governments, move forward harmoniously and reset the world on a path to sustainable prosperity. And this is what I've dedicated my life and my work to. So this is not the first time that we've used science beyond the way we traditionally view it. This is not the first time that science would have a more pervasive relationship with society. Of course, we could look back, and I can put up images of Vesalius and Copernicus and Da Vinci, and we could look at a time where science was pervasive within society, impacting the way we understood trade, the way we understood our relationship with faith, the way we understood the body as a complex network. Each of these achievements over the course of the Renaissance came about from a more systemic, holistic appreciation for science. And whereas the relationship during the Renaissance between art and science was transformative and imbued science with a poetry, with a connection to humanity, with an ability to be creative with its own method, and we could see that manifested centuries later in a text by Edwin Abbott, a book called Flatland. So I think this is an interesting example of a moment in the late 19th century that captures this kind of dynamic. This was a text by an English essayist, so not a scientist, who sought to uncover what a world that was solely living in two dimensions would feel like. So you can imagine pieces of paper sort of moving around on another piece of paper, and that was the universe. And then this two-dimensional universe heard about a third dimension. And they struggled with this idea of what might a third dimension look like. And today, when you hear contemporary physicists talk about the challenges in modern physics of understanding higher dimensional spaces, and I'll show you some reactions to that from designers and architects, they cite texts by English essayists who had the best connection to this challenging contemporary issue of higher dimensional universes. It was an artist, a humanist, who got there first. Today, to compel a 21st century renaissance, a 21st century scientific renaissance, the relationship between science and design is, to me, primary. Design has taken the place of art. That's not to say that there's not a critical role for art in this equation, but design has taken the role of being the way of connecting science to society. Science, in and of itself, is very difficult to bring out to society. It's very difficult to think about educating India in science without some other tool, without some other mechanism. It's very difficult to think about using science and immediately driving economic policy or social policy without some other way of mediating those scientific thinkings, those results, that method. And through what I'll show you now, the relationship between science and design is multifaceted, rich, and growing, and takes on so many different forms. And I think this relationship between science and design is actually one of the most important comings together of the 21st century. So let me start with new knowledge. We have this view that design is at the service of other disciplines, and I've learned through Paula, through interactions with designers, design is substantially more than that. And when you start connecting designers and scientists, to me, one of the most interesting things to start this conversation is actually, can you produce new knowledge? Not simply manifestations of that knowledge or emotional responses to that knowledge, all of it very important, but can you actually arrive at new knowledge in the way that art and science did in the Renaissance? And so instead of flatland, today we see interventions like this. This is called the Morning Line, and it's a collaboration that is bringing forth the idea of a higher dimensional universe by architects, artists, and physicists. And through a physical structure, through the work of architecture, around Delash and Matthew Ritchie and Paul Steinhardt and Arup and wonderful collaborations, you can now start estimating what a physical space might be like that emulates, that mimics, that compels the experience of living in an 11-dimensional space. Now, this might seem like something that's insignificant, inconsequential, but in fact, when I've been in Vienna, in Istanbul with this structure, and seen some of the world's top physicists enter inside it, and through the structure itself, have a different experience, and begin just talking differently, and interacting differently with the ideas of a higher dimensional universe, it's quite profound. And these are serious scientists. These are scientists who, frankly, don't need to give of themselves to these kinds of undertakings. These are scientists who are doing this because they see some intellectual value in stirring up new ideas about really complex topics like a higher dimensional universe. Something more practical, and it's unfortunately very hard to see this, this is a project by Moritz Stephaner, taking 10 years of Wikipedia entries and taking the 100 most contentious articles on Wikipedia. And what it's doing is applying physical form to that data. And every time that there's a vote to keep or delete this article, another unit is added to the line. And the direction of the line is based on whether these are keeps or deletes. So if it's going up the center, keep, delete, keep, delete. If it's veering off to one side strongly, it's moving in that direction. There's strong vehemence in one direction. If it's circling upon itself, you can sort of get the point. The idea is that when you look at something like this, through design bringing forth a new form to something like this, using data and bringing forth a new form, something that we've never looked at before. We've never looked at consensus building this way. We've never looked at how humans negotiate and arrive at consensus. This has great potential when I've presented this kind of work to behavioral economists, to people who think about decision making, to actually give us a new lens into a process that was otherwise quite invisible to us, and certainly not visible at this scale. We can now start understanding how information spreads. We can now start transforming our understanding and modernizing information science and look at uprisings, look at the Arab Spring, the first days in Egypt, via Twitter data, and start looking at the nodes and edges and key influences in that network, and even compare something like this to another country going through a similar uprising, and start to see how the nodal structure, see how the network structure actually varies country to country, uprising to uprising. And now can we actually start surfacing new insights about the behavior of people driving forth social change through the data exhaust that they're leaving behind in social networks. Similarly, we've now seen the adoption by organizations like NASA of proxies to look at human development. So instead of waiting for the next World Bank report, the next UNDP report to tell us how a country or a continent is developing, NASA had the idea of using illumination, of actually measuring light via satellite and using that as a proxy for development. More interesting, though, is that if you now start incorporating social media, social network data, the top, which is Facebook data, and overlaying those two things, so now mashing up the NASA illumination studies of development with the Facebook studies of where's their density of relationships, of networks, of internet usage around the world, we can now start seeing places where there's one and not the other, or a strength of one and not the other, or how over a longitudinal analysis we can see change in things like that. So giving us new tools to understand and anticipate development. Science and design is bringing forth a new opportunity for innovation. We've heard a little bit about manufacturing, I'll mention that, in building and how we think about cities. This is, simply put, a frontier of innovation for companies. This is a project that just premiered last week at the TED conference in California. That was a collaboration between SEED, MIT, and the Scripps Institute, and led by a brilliant architect named Skylar Tibbetts. And this is a project to take ideas in virology of how viruses self-assemble and actually start bringing that to manufacturing scale, bring it to industrial scale, and by spinning this structure, actually see the mechanism by which these forms emerge. And can we now start thinking about self-assembly as a potentially new way of intervening in large-scale industrial manufacturing, recognizing that biology is a far more efficient manufacturing system than anything we've produced. The error rate, the time it takes to manufacture complexity, and so on, the correction mechanisms, can we now start porting some of that knowledge and actually applying physicality to it and rethinking manufacturing? This is work by Neri Oxman at MIT, and in this case, actually starting to surface the math of nature and taking algorithms that we recognize to be quite efficient within nature to produce complexity and produce very sophisticated forms and processes. Can we now start by creating physical forms, intervene and show what those mechanisms, what those algorithms actually are. And by looking at the physical form of the algorithm, as opposed to simply looking at numbers on a computer screen or on a blackboard, by providing a physical form to that algorithm, can we actually start to understand it more meaningfully, more holistically? And this is giving rise to a very, very, very interesting new realm of research in material science. Or finally, in this space, work that Paula curated in Design of the Elastic Mind. This is one of my very favorite projects of all time in all of design by Aran Delash. And in this case, instead of taking an algorithm, this is beyond that, looking at kind of the process of growth. So starting with a single node and actually trying to evolve a resilient structure. And you can see experiments like this and this school of thought. Can we now start looking for more resilient structures of how cities might form, how buildings might form, by taking processes within nature, taking genetic algorithms, evolutionary algorithms, and actually see if we can evolve something, grow something to be more stable and more resilient? Can we understand maybe even financial markets? Can we understand social systems and how they might be more resilient by applying this kind of design thinking to it? And finally, in innovation, this is work we're doing, actually using data and design to create new mechanisms for companies and governments to actually innovate and look to the immensity of the data that they have available to them as a government or as a company and find in it new insights that can drive new innovations just by design intervening with big data. We heard about sort of the human element of this relationship and of design, and I won't spend too much time on this, but this is clearly very important as well, is that when science and design come together, it is bringing forth very famous examples of important humanitarian solutions because of the recognition of connecting scientific knowledge into the design process. To me, this is quite important. When we think about science literacy today and the needs of a modern society and how it will be competitive and prepared for this century, and if we can drive forth towards this ultimate goal of 7 billion scientifically literate people, this is what I think we need in order to achieve the objectives that I laid out at the beginning of the talk. In order to get to 7 billion scientifically literate people, all 1.2 billion of you, all 7 billion on the planet, in order for all of us to be scientifically literate, how can design serve as a way of getting us there faster? And so you heard about synthetic biology. This is what that looks like. These are sort of the bricks of biology that are now starting to transform the way that we are making things. And instead of making things in the past with Lego, today we are looking at DNA as a way of actually starting to manipulate and grow things and change things. And this can be done by 15-year-olds, by 14-year-olds, and really change our relationship with nature and with creation. You had the opportunity to meet some of the students earlier who participated in our visualizing marathon here in Delhi. This is kind of what that looked like. But by interacting, by producing data visualization, by working in the realm of data visualization, and because the tools and technologies of data visualization have become so democratized, it's very simple. The barrier to entry is very low for people to now start intervening with data and through design uncovering new insights about the systems that matter most to their country, to their city, to their lives. And I think that this is a great potential of data visualization beyond its contribution to business, beyond its contribution to government. It's actually a new form of citizen engagement. It's a new form of actually interacting with the scientific method, of doing data science, of doing statistics, of doing math, but now merged with design in a much more powerful way. In 1801, when a geologist wanted to show the relationship between the distribution of the Ottoman Empire, this is what he came up with, this is what William Playfair came up with. And this was adequate. This became a universal understanding of how three things and different distributions of those things in a system related to one another. And it gave birth to this new form that today, obviously, we all universally look at and understand as a pie chart. And today, when we see the plethora of data, and I keep coming back to this theme of data because I think this is really one of the dominant catalysts for why we can now start having scientific thinking be ubiquitous in society, is because this is a key ingredient to being able to do that, is to be able to solve problems with evidence, with data, be able to test our hypotheses as businesses or as governments. So when we look at my genome, for example, it's very difficult to understand what this might look like. It's very difficult to fathom, to appreciate the complexities, the inherent relationships, the interdependencies in something like this. Whereas by applying this kind of form to it, this is work by Ben Fry, by applying physical form to it, we can now start looking at that DNA and its relationship to other species, for example. This is looking at relationship between humans and other DNA sequences that we can map alongside it to understand the homology, the relationships. It gives us a profoundly new appreciation for the complexities, for the system that it is that we're trying to uncover for this complexity. And so, whereas the aesthetic form of design has transformed over the last couple of years, really, and it now looks something like this, and we can now start to appreciate data through this kind of an aesthetic, it has a 200-year-plus history of approaches in science, of new data, of new complexities that are being unearthed through science, being intervened by being manifested through design into ways that reduce the cognitive load and make it possible for us to actually, as humans, interact with it. So whether that's an 11-dimensional space, or whether it's a petabyte of data, or whether it's the entire human genome, ultimately we have to reduce that cognitive load and make it palpable and capable of interaction with. I want to mention this project, which is ongoing. This is something that we're doing right now, which is in response to a citizen science movement. So citizen science is a very powerful manifestation of the democratization of the scientific method today, and we're seeing people around the world participate in efforts to monitor water quality, to count birds migrating, to participate by turning on their computers and allowing them to contribute their computing power to protein folding. Extraordinary projects that are having meaningful, publishable scientific consequence. And this is a project for the International Year of Chemistry with UNESCO and 75,000 students in 80 countries who have been monitoring water quality in their cities, towns, villages around the world. And in response to that, what we've just done, initiated is an experiment in sort of crowd visualization, in collaborative data visualization. Because the tools of data visualization have become so democratized and, again, the barriers are low, can design respond to citizen science? And this is an experiment that's 13 days left on this experiment, and we hope that by World Water Day, the design community is taking this data and collaborating to produce a visualization that can then be turned back to the world on World Water Day to understand it. And it'll go there. So finally, I want to leave you with this concept. We can now, because we have this new type of data, new form of visualizing it, because we have this relationship between science and design, can we compel some new type of insight about the systems, about the cities, about the countries that we live in? And so this is a project that was just published, just released, looking at energy consumption in New York. And so by using new data that had before never been made available to the public, we can now look at our cities in new ways. We can now understand patterns in energy consumption. We might layer this with other types of things. We might layer this with population density or income level. We might start to surface new insights and ultimately produce new maps about the cities that we live in. We might look at, this is Eric Fisher, we might look at where people locate in cities. By using Flickr data, we might actually look on top of a city and say, this is where tourists are and this is where locals are, and actually create a new understanding of how our cities are living and breathing by taking a step out of it, by coming out of the system that we're a part of. When I saw this image, this is the Media Lab at MIT, and this is a project from Joe Paradiso's lab. This is sort of a very obvious image. This is a lot of sensors lit up in a building. And so you've stepped outside of it, and you're looking at that system. And you're looking at temperature, and you're looking at noise, and you're looking at where people are clustering. But something is very profound about this to me. This isn't just sensors, this isn't just data, this isn't just design. Something about this really caused me to think differently about the building and about its inhabitants. And it made me think about this. So in the 1970s, we heard from Apollo astronauts who had been to space of the enormous transformational reaction that they had to stepping outside of the system that they were a part of. And in later years, this became known as the overview effect, the consequence of actually stepping outside a system that you were once a part of and seeing it anew. And one of the Apollo astronauts said this: you realize that on that little blue and white thing is everything that means anything to you. All of history and music and poetry and art, and you realize that there's something new there, that the relationship is no longer what it once was. And what happened after this, after stepping outside the system in the United States, is it helped give birth to the environmental movement. We saw Silent Spring, we saw the birth of the EPA. An entire environmental movement came about as a result of, catalyzed by, stepping outside the system and seeing its fragility. So in that case, it was its fragility. It was seeing it all as one unified blue dot, and as something very fragile. Today, when we step outside of our system, We're seeing it as something more complex. We're seeing it as something more interconnected. We're seeing it as something that's changing more rapidly as a result of designing and interacting with data. And so my question to us collectively, as we've heard the challenges today, as we heard about sort of the need for this new lens to interact with the world's challenges, what might we give birth to as a society by stepping outside of these systems? By actually now not only having the data available to us, by visualizing that data, but perhaps even more profoundly than when we looked at the Earth from above, today we are actually producing that data. We recognize that we're the ones who are contributing the electronic health records. We're the ones who are turning on our mobile devices and allowing them to be tracked. We're the ones who are leaving exhaust behind when we're using social media. So we are the ones contributing to the data. To a large extent, we can now be the ones who are visually interacting with that data and producing these new maps. And so my question to us is, what might we now compel in response to that by bringing science and design together? Thank you.